We're winding down. I mentioned I would comment on FINRA. For those of you who follow this issue, the issue is licensing investment bankers under the Securities Acts of 33 and 34. It's been a controversial area for about 12 years. There have been numerous parties trying to get the laws changed. There was a series of letters written by, I think it was 8 or 10 congressmen to Mary Shapiro of the SEC, and literally in the last month. They're trying to get some kind of a special exemption. Here's the problem with that. They may in fact get it, although they've been 12 years trying it, and they may not. But whether they do or not grant an exemption for limited special services firms, they're going to create, in many of our opinions, a second class of M&A advisory services. And I mean that in both senses of the word. A different class, but second class as in second-class citizens is what is a very good chance of getting done, because they're going to be very limited in the services they can provide. And for those of us who do a lot of M&A activity, we know that it covers a spectrum of things, from corporate finance to private equity group finance, which is corporate finance, to the transfer of business interests, and so forth and so on. So I'm not sure that it's going to create a class that, if it even happens, that many of us want to be in. So who wins in this thing? Well, first of all, it's specialization. Secondly, generalist practices are only going to be at the very bottom of the market. They're going to be for these difficult-to-sell companies. The firms, one world our world is growing increasingly specialized, so it's going to be firms with specialty practices. It's going to be larger firms with more depth and experience, and it's going to be licensed broker-dealers, mainly for the credibility and the respectability, and above all, because if you're doing M&A right now and you're not a licensed broker-dealer, you are at a huge, huge risk. I've been deeply involved in this subject matter for quite a few years. On the individual bankers, it is not, again, the one- and two-man firms. It's going to be the bankers that are team players. There's just too much going on. You get better deal coverage. You have more minds, more experience, better pitches. We just need a group of people in a complex world that work together on an individual level, not just those. And again, the legally licensed bankers, I think, are going to be the ones that are successful, and the old head in the sand thing's just not going to work that well. So there you go. I think it came to within 1 minute of 45 minutes. And questions, I'd be glad to answer.
Oh, thank you, Dennis. That was a great overview. There's a lot of very valuable information that I know will have a lot of people thinking at the beginning of this year about what 2012 is going to hold. We did have a number of questions come in from the audience that I'd like to ask you on their behalf. But first, a reminder to everyone, if you do have a question, please feel free to submit it using email today. My email address is ecailey, E-C-A-L-E-Y, @firmex.com, or if you can reply to any of the invites that have gone out to you from Firmex over the last couple of days, and we'll get those questions. And we'll try and get as many answered as we can in the next 10 minutes or so. So Dennis, let me start off with one that touches on one of your earlier slides. A question came in from Jennifer about the identity factor you mentioned with baby boomers. What do I do the day after I sell my company? Have you seen anything practical that has proven successful that an advisor can do to help mitigate or minimize the identity factor?
Well, there's yes, to some degree I have, and it's also an area that I frankly find myself giving a lot of thought to. But the minimum that an advisor can do is talk that out early on with the client, because there's two things that go on with the identity crisis situation. One is it's there, okay, and two is that it's not there at the beginning of the transaction. It becomes very acute just before the end of the transaction. So you can modify and mitigate some of the anxiety and some of the emotion by talking about it. Hey, it can be casual. It's not a lecture. What are you planning to do? What a great opportunity to do different things. The irony of the identity crisis is that almost everybody survives it. These are men and women that have created businesses. They've done a tremendous thing, and it's now time. to move into a different phase. There's a great book. Forgive me. It's Getting Younger Next Year, I think it is, and I can make sure it's sent out to you. But it was really written by a physician and an attorney, it started out to be a book written about exercise and staying in condition and that type of thing. But it actually devoted some really interesting chapters to life after 65 and how rewarding it can be. So even recommending, some books and so forth might help.
Okay, great. The second question we had was from Stephen, and his question was about advice on handling clients, and in this case I believe he means sellers, who move the goalposts during the deal, so who want a better price for their company due to more buyer interest or potentially slightly better results in the business in general. What's the best way of handling those clients, in your opinion?
Well, that's a really good question, and it depends on the cause. If the business is suddenly producing better results and they appear to be sustainable, then my sympathy is with the client. Assuming he hasn't gotten to a settlement, whatever it is he has, that business has become more valuable. And I don't see any particular problem. I mean, there are obviously deal problems, but there's certainly no moral problems or ethical problems, of the client wanting to assert that the company came into some huge contracts during the process. I'd want more money for my company. So that's one thing. The other reason a client might move the goalpost may have to do with not conducting the transaction very well on the part of the advisor. Generally speaking, clients are going to insist that their companies have a certain value. There's a little bit of what I call an intimidation process going on. They think that by intimidating the advisor with, I need this and I need that they're somehow going to get more. Well, an M&A transaction properly conducted doesn't have anything to do with putting a price tag on a company. It has to do with creating an auction. And if you explain to your client that you're going to create an auction, that in the process of creating that, we may not use the term auction, but in the process of creating that, we're now going to gather together, let's call it 10 buyers, and we're going to find out what the market is for your company at this point in time. That takes the burden off of you and puts it on the marketplace. If my client disagrees with my estimate of value, I'm usually okay with that as long as he's within about 10 or 15% of my estimate, because the market's going to teach him. So there's a lot the banker or the advisor can do about that up front. But if you have an absolutely crazy client who's just moving boundaries for neurotic reasons, then I suggest you get a new client.
That's good advice. We've had a couple of questions come in about Europe, and I know you've sort of mentioned we could do a whole webinar on that in itself. The one specific question came up regarding your mention of the need for international presence, or the increasing need to have an international presence. And this is a question asking for your opinion, where the action is, or is increasingly, like a BRIC country, Brazil or China, starting an international presence somewhere there, or somewhere where maybe the culture and the language and maybe the legal system is a little bit closer to home, like U.S. expanding into Canada, or the UK, or something in Western Europe. What would be your advice?
Well, I would stay with the big countries, even though the BRIC countries are beginning to get very active. The main countries are Western Europe and India, increasingly so. Keep in mind that India, much like the United States, was a colony at one time of Great Britain, and so that the legal structures and the language, legal structures are essentially rooted in English common law, and the language is English, although with their own flavor and their own accents. Most people in Europe, we're one of the few monolingual countries in the world. Most Europeans, I find, almost all relatively educated class Europeans are at least if not trilingual. And if they're bilingual, it's always English. So I'm not talking about establishing practices over there. I'm talking about establishing relationships with other advisors over there who you can then say are your correspondent advisors in Germany or the UK or whatnot. You don't need a bunch. Find one in each country. You know, all of a sudden you've covered 15 countries, and now you can talk about it. And now when you're selling against my firm, I lose my advantage because you have the same thing I do.
Right, and actually one of we had a comment from one of the folks attending today named Mitch who has a practical piece of advice saying attending a conference for broker dealers in the country you're potentially interested in developing that relationship, where you can meet a lot of people over the course of a weekend or over the course of a short conference, has been a successful tactic for him.
I love that. I think it's a tremendous suggestion. Thank you, Mitch.
Okay, good. I think that's all we have time for on the question side, unless you have any closing comments on, you know, your outlook on 2012. As I mentioned, a couple of the other questions were more generally about the impact of the European market. Any final comments before we wrap up, Dennis?
Yeah, I just very, very quickly, you know, it's really ironic about M&A. If a macroeconomy is shrinking and public companies need to grow, they can't grow organically, so they have to grow by acquisition. So there's actually a reverse phenomenon that tends to take place within limits, particularly if the macroeconomy has been down for a couple of years. So, and right now our macroeconomy shows every sign of a very strong, well, I shouldn't say very strong, but a steady recovery. Our big problem is unemployment. Our productivity levels are very high. My own firm, and I've talked to other people that have had the same experience, had the best year in its history in 2011. And we'll see what 2012 brings, but right now it's looking pretty good.
That's great. That's wonderful. Let's hope that holds true for everybody who attends the call. So thanks, Dennis, so much for all of the insights you shared with us for today and all of your practical advice. And thanks to everybody who attended and those of you who submitted a question. For those of you who'd like to review this webinar again or would like to share it with your colleagues who couldn't attend, we'll be providing a link to the recording in our follow-up email in the next day or two. And just a reminder that our next webinar will be held on February 21st at 1 p.m. Eastern, and stay tuned for details on that. And thanks again to everybody for attending today. Thank you, Dennis.
Yeah. Thank you, Dennis. This is Joel. I much appreciate it, and that was a tremendous presentation. I certainly personally learned a lot, and we'll be in touch.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.